This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. G'day, I'm Kate Watson. China is just such a constant news topic in a place that is endlessly fascinating. Such a different society, such a different political system, such a different approach to news. So to be able to sit down with Will Glasgow, the only Australian journalist currently working in China after being granted a visa just a few months ago, well, I had questions. As you listen, you'll notice how generous Will is in explaining his experience of finally landing his dream job of China correspondent for the Australian newspaper in early 2020. And then the frustration of not being able to do that job after all Aussie journalists had to leave in September of the same year. He's back now though, and we start by talking through the challenges in doing his job now, including the very real consideration of his safety and the safety of his sources. We then talk about Taiwan, where Will was based in lieu of being able to be based in China. We talk about the people there and how they deal with the ongoing and enduring intimidation by China. The context being, China believes Taiwan should fold underneath it. Taiwan is a democracy who would prefer to maintain the status quo. And then we chat about Hong Kong, a place that hasn't managed to do that. Will laughs easily throughout this interview. Perhaps it's his way of managing the intensity of being a journalist in a nation that is so perplexing, impenetrable, and yes, at times comical. But at the end of this chat, the laughter stops when I ask him about Cheng Lei, the Chinese-Australian journalist who was detained in China for doing her job. Will is serious about just how lucky we are to live in Australia. Let's go back to the start of 2020. You were based in China as the newly appointed China correspondent. COVID hits. I mean, fast forward to, I think it was September of the same year, so September 2020, there are no journalists left in China. Can you fill that gap for people as to not just your personal story, but just broadly what happened? I think we kind of forget this part of it.
It's worth that noting, I guess, at the start, there weren't many of us to start with, right? So when I flew in January 3, 2020, there was Bill Birtles, the ABC correspondent. The ABC hadn't yet been allowed to replace its second journalist. It's for almost a decade had two correspondents, maybe longer than a decade, had two correspondents in China. And the Chinese governments had stonewalled that second journalist. So they were already tightening the amount of access they were giving media. It already felt like the China I flew into in January 3, 2020, there were plenty of signs that, particularly for English language media, the high water mark had passed and we were in a much tighter environment. Yeah, so ABC had one, Bill Birtles, and was lobbying to get the second, but it hadn't happened. The Herald had no one. And then the Fin Review had Mike Smith in Shanghai. That's it. So there were two. I flew in and we increased to three, right? That's how many there were of us. Now, a few years before, there was a correspondent from SBS. Like I said, there were two from ABC. There was an Australian correspondent, a Sydney Morning Herald correspondent, and the Fin. So at full strength, we were six. But by the time I was there, it was three.
And just explain the politics behind that tightening of Western media by China.
Well, I mean, look, the Chinese government doesn't, with a lot of these decisions, these kind of things, they don't hold a press conference or give a background briefing for us all to understand why things have happened, right? So we have to deduct and just look at what happened and what can we, based on conversations we have and other things, what can we best work out? But the best theory is that the Chinese government's decided it doesn't need international media, at least on the scale it used to. A lot of the increase in the numbers happened in the lead up to and at the time of the Beijing Olympics in 2008, when the International Olympic Committee insisted on, as a prerequisite for China to be able to host, improved freedoms for journalists in China. So with the Olympics, foreign correspondents could finally travel around China, leave Beijing or Shanghai, wherever they were posted, without getting formal permission from the Chinese government. Up until the Olympics, you had to do that every time you leave. That's a benefit I still get, right? So I can go around China and I don't have to ask the Chinese Foreign Ministry's permission to go on a trip. So that's a change that stayed. But also what happened in the lead up to that Beijing Olympics, again, with the pressure and the eyes of the world on it, I think in a demonstration, China wanted to show of its openness or increasing openness. They were accrediting a lot more international journalists, and including from Australia. They have made a call that by the time I arrived in January 2020, that China I flew into, the government was absolutely furious about English language reporting on Xinjiang. So one of the reasons the ABC probably couldn't get that second correspondent its journalist Mark Carney had done. He was basically just doing long-form pieces, and at least from a Chinese perspective, he was just working through the issues they most hate, right? He wasn't writing
And what are they?
Well, he had done a thing on Xinjiang, right? And that was I think it was broadcast in 2019, but on as best as what could be understood, what was happening with the Uyghur community in Xinjiang, where based on very credible evidence, up to maybe more than 1 million Uyghurs went through, the Chinese government called it a training facilities, once they acknowledged that it happened, but a lot of the international press called it, and NGOs and the Uyghurs who were in it, were calling them prison camps or detention centres. So he'd reported on what was happening to Uyghur people in there, and a whole bunch of other things. I mean, the other things that are very sensitive in China are ethnic relations. So anything involving non-Han Chinese populations in China, like the Uyghurs or Tibetans, and any link between those people and any challenges of China's territory. So the Uyghurs, demands amongst members of the Uyghur community for an independent country.
We're going to talk about Taiwan because you were based there after you were unable to be based in China. But just fast forwarding, I guess, through the nearly 4 years that we haven't had any journalists in China. You're the first Australian journalist to go back. How did it come to be that you were able? Why you?
Again, they don't give us clear briefings, right? The Chinese government on why things happen. So you have to deduce some things. But I've been involved in this, so I got some evidence points to go on. And I think, a key thing is, through a quirk of history, I wasn't in China in August 2020. I was back in Australia on a family personal trip for some stuff with my parents, and then also to get my wife, who didn't want to go through the Chinese quarantine network by herself. So I got an exemption visa we both had that was going to allow us to come back through China's COVID travel ban back into China. We were due to come in late August, but just before we flew back, Cheng Lei, the Australian journalist who's an anchor at China's English language broadcaster, CGTN, she was announced detained. She'd already been detained 3 weeks earlier by Chinese security, but she was announced detained by the Australian Foreign Minister at the time, Maurice Payne, and that just set off. I had literally had a briefing from DFAT the week before that, where but by that stage, the Australia-China relationship was just terrible. And I was just checking if there was anything they wanted to tell me about. And the advice was, kind of exercise caution, and a whole bunch of the risks that were there before I had arrived in 2020 was still there, but some things were even a bit worse or whatever. But it wasn't don't go, right? But then after the foreign minister announced Cheng Lei's detention, I got urgent advice from very high up in DFAT that I wasn't to get my flight.
And that's when those other journalists eventually, in the coming weeks, were turned back home.
Exactly. And that's why, So that's why by September 1, 2020, there was no Australian journalists, because the last two, Mike Smith and Bill Birtles, were escorted out of the country by Australian diplomats after being linked to that Cheng Lei case. So the whole thing was just completely bonkers, yeah.
And given all of that context, what is it like to be a journalist in China now? I mean, I feel like you've only been there sort of a couple of months, not even, perhaps.
2.5 months back, I went back in August.
How is it now for you?
My experience is quite weird because I only had 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks before the COVID era. What I can now see was the COVID era had begun in China at the start of 2020. So for me, actually, going in now, it's still a terrible reporting environment. It's still, you're still operating in a place where officials almost laugh at you if you ask, how could I have an interview with a minister or a person of any authority in the government? Still got all those reporting challenges, but I don't have all the movement restrictions from before. I can go in and out of my apartment compound without going through past sort of local level police or community enforcers and things. And again, I could travel around the country. I can just hop on a train or go on a plane and stuff.
Well, I think, you mentioned, as a journalist, the reporting environment means you'd love to get an interview with a minister and you'd love to talk with officials. You'd love to talk with, I guess, anyone connected to the government. But you probably do get to just talk with Chinese people. Like, I think in even your just report, that you did a fantastic report on returning and what it was like. You said, I think there's a photo of you sitting at a park bench next to just a member of the public and having a conversation with her and then mentioning you're a journalist. How does the public react to you when you say, I'm a journalist from Australia, I'd love to chat with you?
Look, there aren't many foreigners in China, right? There's so few foreigners that me sitting on a bench in Beijing.
You stick out, right?
Right. And that's a part of Beijing that's surrounded by embassies. I mean, how weird's that? But that just shows how few there are, right? Caught her eye and she heard me talking and she asked where I was from. And it turned out that she was a doctor and a retired doctor, and she had gone and done training in Sydney at the Royal Children's Hospital in the mid-'80s. And so she loved Australia. She just kept saying, this is so lucky. I can't believe I met someone from Australia. I can't believe, when I said I was from Sydney, she just could not believe it. Like, this has been fated in the stars, right? And then she asked me, she came back, actually, we're doing these photos for the piece on my return back to Beijing. And then she asked, what do I do? I said, I'm a journalist from Australia. And then everything changed. She had been so friendly and so excited to meet an Australian, an old friend from Australia. And then, the word journalist, it was like I'd said, if like in Australia, if I'd been like, I'm a terrorist. I mean, it was just her jaw dropped and she just kept saying the word journalist. And she said, they let you have a visa? She's just, so it's kind of shocking. There's very few journalists, and people in China have been told to keep. I mean, there's big campaigns of telling people to beware of journalists and of spies. And
this is my question: is it? I mean, it's probably a hard thing to answer, but is it because of what she's afraid of? Or is it because she personally doesn't like journalists from the West?
I think it's a lot. Well, I can't speak for her. We weren't going to have much more of a conversation once I'd out of myself. she couldn't get away fast enough.
Yeah.
I mean, from conversations with other people, and look, there's a lot of people in China, so they'll have different views. But there are big campaigns in China warning people about the foreign media. And I mean, the foreign media has been a kind of hate figure since the Olympics, at least that long. So concurrent with that increased opening up, there were more stories on China and the Chinese government, but also a lot of people in China, they're not used to our style of reporting, right? That they're not used to seeing published things that aren't always flattering about China. And China's not perfect, far from it. And part of the response to that is to accuse international journalists of just looking to smear China, constantly going out of their way to make China look bad, right? There are warnings to, beware of journalists who will try to twist your words or people who will say they're a journalist, but actually they're much worse. I mean, this is a more recent campaign now, which I think that the fear, her response seemed more worried. I think that this would be more related to this new thing, which is not the earlier one. You get people giving you these tedious lectures about the media and what's wrong with the media and which is not so different. You get that sometimes when you say you're a journalist in Australia, right? I get that all the time. Sometimes, like when people ask,
you get that here.
Do I have the strength to have this conversation? But but now in China, there's a big campaign about foreign spies, and the Ministry of State Security, they put out these like literally cartoons of incidents of like spycraft or whatever, and how the Chinese security agencies have cracked down on it. And a couple of the cartoons have featured people who say they're journalists, but they're actually spies. And like, yeah, they're trying to educate the Chinese public to be on guard at all times and stuff. And I think that's certainly raised the fear level.
Yeah. So how do you go about having conversations and reporting then? Like, how frustrating is it, I guess, for you? But also, how do you do your job well when you get that reaction from people?
Well, you get it from some people, but there's a lot of people, right? And not everyone has that view. And just because the Chinese government tells people things or puts it out in their WeChat channel or whatever doesn't mean everyone believes it. So there's plenty of people who, I mean, God, for every person who comes up to me like that, I get people who, when I say I'm a journalist, they just start talking so frankly, it's shocking sometimes. I mean, there is a lot of people who just, they're thrilled that when they hear I'm a journalist like this, they just think, rightly, that I'm going to be interested in hearing what they think. And they want to talk about politics, and they want to talk about often what I think about China, what I think about Chinese foreign relations, or what I think about some incident that's being censored or not spoken about freely in China. And that's a lot of topics. So, there are a lot of people who, will talk extremely frankly. So the big challenge for a reporter is not actually getting people to talk to you. There's a lot of challenges in China. One of them is that people tell you all that stuff, and it's fascinating and really useful and really interesting insight into their views. How you balance that within, well, how many people's this person speaking to, right? Like, what's the weight you put on that? That's really hard. There's 1.4 billion people in China, and they live very diverse, different lives. And so it's sort of, you've got to just remember, well, what's the background of this person? And the other thing, of course, is that what do you do with it? So people tell you all this great stuff, but, I know if I quote those people with their name, with identifying information, they can get into a lot of trouble. Like, things can happen to them that I would struggle to live with myself if I'd been responsible, if my reporting had got them in trouble. But the risk is on people we speak to in China.
Do you find, are people more informed about the rest of the world than you expected, or less, or about what you would have assumed?
Look, you can speak to some very well-informed people and people who are less well-informed. But one thing, America's an obsession in China. I mean, one of the things that's really striking in China, or one of the strong impressions I get is, I mean, I'm an Australian, I'm a New Zealand Australian, right? A dual citizen. For me, I just am constantly staggered by it when people in China, the government's the worst at this, but you do hear it amongst just people in China. They talk all often as if there's China and America, and you're just like, hello.
And like, that's it.
Yeah. I mean, they really, or if they talk about other countries, it's just, where do they fit within China and America? Australia is reduced to a US ally. And I mean, all autonomy is taken away, and Australia's just either too stupid to realize that it's been wound up and instructed to do things by America, or it's a willing accomplice for America. But it's never, there's almost never any acknowledgement that Australia is its own country, and one of many in the world, and they've got their own ideas, and there's a big world out there outside of China.
After my divorce, I couldn't afford the mortgage by myself, let alone all the other costs. Hosting on Airbnb was the only solution that kept me afloat and allowed me to stay in my home. It keeps me busy, especially on top of 2 other jobs, but hosting gives me independence and control over my future.
Hosting on Airbnb has become a lifeline for many Australians. That's why we want to work with governments to find solutions that benefit the whole community. Find out more at airbnb.com/stronger together.
What do you think? I'm interested in, obviously, the US election. And do you think China's hoping for a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency, or do you think it's much of a muchness for them? From a government perspective, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, ultimately, China today is run by Xi Jinping, the president and general secretary of the Communist Party. So it's really, what does he think? And I've put in my request for an interview, but he hasn't come back yet, right? He doesn't talk about this stuff. So you just have to grasp at what do his underlings say and what does the Chinese propaganda machine say. We've got the experience. I mean, he was the president. He was in his same position for the first 4 years of the Trump presidency. Trump had quite a few China policies there, right? I mean, I think the Chinese for a bit thought Trump was good and a transactional guy they could work with. And then they were absolutely shocked by his final year where he unleashed or allowed bits of his administration, Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, and some of his national security advisors to speak so critically about the Chinese government and almost call for the overthrowing of the Chinese Communist Party at points. So he's erratic, and the Chinese attitude to things is they're just going to deal with what's there, right? They're going to make the best of whoever's the president. Again, this is just speculative because, Xi Jinping hasn't informed us all on this. But from the way they behave, they want to just keep out of it. They don't want to look like they're influencing the election, and they will see opportunities and risks in both. Biden, his work with US allies has really annoyed's too polite, really angered China. They feel really threatened by that. Xi Jinping himself has said that. This isn't one where we're guessing. Xi Jinping, in a very unusual comment at a political gathering in Beijing, it was reported in state media really prominently that Xi Jinping directly had said that America is working to contain China and stop it rising. And he said that to all the senior comrades. So that's in the Biden administration. He never said that in the Trump one. So the Biden teams really put a lot of pressure on Xi, at least as it looks at military posture in the region. But the Biden administration's also inherited a bunch of positions from the Trump administration and is building on those. So the Chinese, the official line they put out is it's 2 bowls of poison for China. It's just which one are we going to have to eat?
Well, it brings us neatly to Taiwan. I guess this is one of the major sticking points. And I'm talking to you during a week where we saw a Chinese military drill. They encircled Taiwan. I did a little bit of reading about some of your reporting on this, particularly in 2022. I mean, you kind of, and I might read you something that you wrote and then ask you about it. You wrote, right now, Beijing is firing ballistic missiles over the island and staging a blockade in a chilling display of its military strength. Its horrendous behaviour, the stoicism of most of its 23 million people, the Taiwanese people, in the face of routine threats of military annihilation is incredible. Talk to me about what it's like for Taiwan. Big question.
Yeah, and look, there's not as many people in Taiwan.
But you did live there.
I did. Look, there's 23 million people in Taiwan, and I mean, it's a very robust, lively, liberal democracy, and people have a lot of opinions, and they love to express them, and they're very and
they're allowed to,
and they're very proud of that. And they weren't always, right. They were an authoritarian country until the late 80s. So it's a young democracy, and very, very proud that it's no longer living under martial law. But I mean, wow, those Pelosi drills, the disconnect between the international conversation about the People's Liberation Army's military drills around China after Pelosi's visit, and even the fear of them as the visit was approaching. There was such panic, whereas in Taiwan, it was just another day. I mean, it was stunningly normal.
And just for context, so what you're referring to is when Nancy Pelosi visited back in 2022, and it was such, I just will never forget it. It was such a big deal. And
so she was the most senior American official since Newt Gingrich to go, the third most senior figure in the US government at the time, of the same party as the president, unlike Gingrich back in the Clinton presidency. He was a Republican and the president was a Democrat. So the Chinese had tried so hard to stop it happening and put so much pressure on. Their explanation was, privately, was that they needed to teach America and Taiwan a lesson. So they held these huge drills for almost a week around the island. And in classic Chinese Communist Party way, as well as holding the drills, they unleashed this huge propaganda campaign about them, trying to scare and intimidate the Taiwanese people. But thing that's really strange in Taiwan, Taiwan has lived with the threat of war, the threat of invasion from China for as long that Taiwan, as a self-governed place, goes back to, of its current iteration, goes back to 1949 when the nationalist government in China withdrew in the Civil War from mainland China, and the Chinese Communist Party took over the mainland. And the nationalists retreated to Taiwan. They thought it was just for a few years until they launched a counteroffensive, but here Taiwan is. So from that eventually evolved Taiwan, this independent state. But that whole way through, from 1949, the Chinese Communist Party has threatened and at times, bombarded Taiwan and Taiwan's outer islands with missiles and stuff. So that threat of war is not a thought experiment for people in Taiwan. They've lived with it for a long time, but they've also, they've lived for generations. And so people are, you could say they're numb to it, or maybe they're resigned to it, or they're just, they're stoic. I mean,
I think you even used in one of your pieces the word relaxed. You explained that they just had this normal day, like they just walked around and did their normal lives.
I remember it was Mother's Day, and I remember going out to Vox Pop people. This was the day the drills began, and everyone was just telling me, "Oh, I've just been out with my mum. We had a nice breakfast," and I'm like, "Yeah." But so the Pelosi drills, or the ballistic missiles they shot over, and they're just like, "Oh, no, I'm not very worried about that." And
so, what's your assessment then, I guess, of how we would know? I mean, we hear this is one of the, it's such a news thing, like escalating tensions and ratcheting up of tensions, or there's, but I guess to your point, you've just explained the context. Like this has got a long history, and do you think that there's a point? Do you think we're getting closer to a point where this comes to a head, or do you think we won't know?
Well, I mean,
how do we assess that? I guess people reading the news and going, how serious is this?
Just because people in Taiwan are relaxed doesn't mean they've got some special, I mean, it's worth noting that. And, Taiwan is it's a very safe place, actually. The great fear is of a Chinese military attack on Taiwan. Well, you're not going to work that out by talking to people at IKEA in Taiwan about how they, what they're, that's going to happen not because Taiwanese people started it. That will happen because the Chinese government launches that attack, right? And I mean, there's a huge debate on what are China's intentions China wants to govern and rule Taiwan, but launching an invasion of Taiwan, a lot of people talk with great confidence about a coming war there. People talk about this with very little idea of how complicated that would be. It's not to say it's impossible, but it's an extremely difficult military operation. If this was a proper invasion, the numbers are staggering. Taiwan is close to China, but I caught a ferry for 8 hours from the outer islands of Taiwan to Taiwan main island. It's not that close. So they've got to go a long way across the Taiwan Strait before we get to Taiwan island. So I think some people talk too casually about China launching a war on Taiwan. I think one of the dumbest things you hear is people talk about China launching a war of distraction. The economy's not going well, so they launch a war on Taiwan. I just think that completely overlooks the entire behavior of the Chinese Communist Party. They are so risk averse, so controlling. The idea that things aren't going well, so they launch one of the most difficult military operations of all time, a war that, if it doesn't go amazingly well, could well lead to the end of the Chinese Communist Party, the thing they fear the most, and their control of China with it. I mean, the stakes are existential for the Chinese Communist Party in that thing. And I just don't think they're going to get involved in something with those stakes unless they have to. And from their perspective, what that is, when do they have to? The thing I also wouldn't dismiss is when they say if Taiwan formally announced independence, so Taiwan is self-governed, has its own democracies, it has its own tax department, they have their own passports, rah, rah, rah. it's a de facto state, but it hasn't formally announced an independent state of Taiwan. It's still formally called the Republic of China. There's still something called it's sort of the one China fiction, that the squidge that allows all this to kind of, an ambiguity that allows Taiwan. Taiwan has never been announced as a separate state. And the Chinese claim it's sort of unfinished business from the Civil War. But they've tolerated that ambiguity. I think if the Taiwanese ever tried to end that ambiguity with the Chinese Communist Party still of its current view, yeah, I think that would start a war. But that's not news to anyone in Taiwan. No political party in Taiwan goes to an election saying we're going to formally announce the independence of Taiwan. They know, and that's not because they don't feel independent, but because they know
what it might cause.
Well, what the Chinese government has said very clearly it would cause.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So what they all want to do and what they all say is they want to maintain the status quo, which for them means Taiwan is governed by Taiwanese. Taiwan elects its own government.
I can't help but just thinking about Hong Kong when you talk about this. I mean, it's just been a softly approach, and to a certain degree. And I think is that more of the risk for Taiwan than an all-out war, I guess, is actually like this softly influence, and then.
Well, that's what the Chinese government would like, right? What Beijing would like, but they ruled like Hong Kong was part of the People's Republic of China, and they governed it. It had a Hong Kong territorial government, but that answered to Beijing. There's no ambiguity or questioning around that. After the handover from the British, that's what the arrangement was. The Chinese Communist Party has never ruled Taiwan, so it doesn't have any. It claims that it has legal powers over Taiwan. So these latest drills, it said they were policing drills, that it was just policing its territory of Taiwan, that it was just a Coast Guard operation. I mean, I laugh, it's sick, right? But that's what they say. But they don't have the ability to that Hong Kong was ended with Beijing passing a law, forcing a law on Hong Kong, the national security law. Beijing can write a law for Taiwan, but Taiwan doesn't. I mean, Taiwan just laugh at it. They will just laugh at it.
Yeah.
So, but all that said, yeah, they're related. I mean, the one country, two systems formula, that was the Chinese Communist Party idea that we all know for its application in Hong Kong. But that idea was for Taiwan, but the Taiwanese rejected it. And then the Chinese government said they were going to try it on Hong Kong. They used that same idea. They saw a benefit there to allow bits of the old British system. But
have you been to Hong Kong?
Yeah. I used to have to go all my visa runs because of the weird relationship between Beijing and Taipei. Every short-term trip I did wasn't based again in Beijing until August this year. But while I was in Taipei in that 3-year period, I went into Beijing for the Winter Olympics, and then last year on 4 short-term reporting trips. And each one of those trips, I'd have to go to Hong Kong to get apply for my visa for China. It was my closest visa office. So, yeah.
Are you surprised we don't talk about it as much as the attention that was on it, 2018, 2019?
Hong Kong?
Yeah, something in focus for you, like just how it's changed?
I think...
Or not. It
was such an enormous, like, that 2018, 2019, those protest movements then, when you had, like, that was about the anti-extradition law. You had more than 1 million people in Hong Kong, a city of 8 million. I mean, some of the rallies maybe had 2 million people, so almost a quarter of the population out on the streets. It was an extraordinary event in Hong Kong, but nothing like that is possible in Hong Kong now. As of the national security law came in during the pandemic, and Hong Kong has completely changed, but all the terms have changed. So I was talking about earlier the ethical dilemmas for a reporter in China. That people will tell you things, but how do you report it without getting them in trouble? That's all come to Hong Kong in a huge way. The national security law means I can go into Hong Kong without I don't need a visa to do journalism in Hong Kong, which is completely abnormal. In China, you can't just rock up as a journalist. It's very hard to get in. But Hong Kong, you still can, but So the journalist, can go in, but man, you can get people in a lot of trouble. I mean, that national security law, the way they've drafted it, the way Beijing drafted it, it's all about greyness and a total lack of clarity around what is in breach of the national security law, which has up to lifetime imprisonment sentences. So, yeah, they've just completely snuffed out with that law the pro-democracy and much more, like a lot of civic life. It's unclear where it sits within the national security law. So, yeah, that's partly why there's just such a Hong Kong's changed so much. I mean, Hong Kong is still a beautiful city. I mean,
you can go there, you can enjoy it. Like, you don't want to deter people.
It's amazing. Yeah. Well, and like, it's a trope that Hong Kong's just another Chinese city now. That's not true, right? I live in a Chinese city. I go to a lot of Chinese cities. Hong Kong, okay, to start with, Hong Kong is on the other side of the Chinese firewall, right? People in Hong Kong don't all live behind the Chinese censorship machine. They don't. So when you talk to people in Hong Kong, you're talking in a much more similar information world. In China, you hear things often that are just so strange, or they're talking about something in the total opposite way. And it's because so many people there live within the Chinese propaganda information world if they don't have VPNs. So Hong Kong's totally different. Hong Kong, though, there's a real sadness. I mean, every time I've been into Hong Kong since its reopening in COVID, I'm always struck by the beauty of the harbour, how delicious the food is. It still has a great energy now that it's post-pandemic. I mean, it really does. There's so much that I love about that place, but it's never long I'm in Hong Kong before someone tells me about their plans to leave, about how they're getting paperwork. Yeah, and it's sad. Like it's a sad story. It's in a sad phase.
I wanted to ask you, Will, of course, part of your job is obviously you work for The Australian, you report on the Australian angle. Yeah. We've got an Australian election coming up soon. I'm really interested in some of the reporting lately and commentary lately from yourself and others around the positioning that our government has on China. We know that they've sort of softened the relationship. The relationship's a lot better than it was under Scott Morrison. But many assumed, I think, Peter Dutton would have more of a hard line against China. But I've seen you write recently that he's actually softening his view a little bit. Can you explain the local politics at play here as you see it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting trend going into this next election, where both of the parties, particularly the opposition under Dutton, is trying to campaign saying you can vote for us and we're going to continue to protect and promote the trade relationship with China. So a vote for us isn't a vote of returning to bans on Australian exports to China or whatever. Yeah, there's an awareness that there's been a question mark amongst a bunch of voters about the coalition's handling of the relationship. And while, polling shows the Chinese government is not trusted by Australians, it's hugely unpopular, the public's divided on how the coalition government handled that relationship. Some people think that they handled it very well, that they were tough and firm and stood up for Australian sovereignty. And it's almost like 50-50, the polling shows. Another half think they were hairy-chested, they made a difficult situation much worse, and that Australian farmers particularly bore the brunt of that through the trade coercion. It's mixed. So, I mean, the notable thing is the change, and like Peter Dutton was one of the most hardline members of the Morrison cabinet in his rhetoric about China, particularly in that 2021-2022 period, in the lead up to the election that they lost. So his rhetorical change is really noticeable. He now speaks publicly. He really wants to stress the positive on the trade relationship and then also the role of Chinese Australians in Australia. I think, though, what's forgotten or maybe isn't spoken of enough is that the Albanese government, for the most part, it almost entirely continues all the policies that the Turnbull and Morrison government had on China. So it's changed its tone and it's made a point of really stressing dialogue and re-engaging dialogue and then maintaining those channels. But the substance of its policies, they're almost entirely a continuation of policy settings made by the Turnbull government and then the Morrison government. So there was actually a huge bipartisan consensus on China policy. There's little debates over it, but actually, look, I think the coalition privately admit that the government's done kind of well on getting the trade bans off. They make a lot of areas they think the government's gone soft on, but actually, if you press them on it, they really struggle to find any of much substance. I think people close to Peter Dutton have told me when I've asked about this, they say, if you speak to, they say Peter Dutton is Peter Dutton. He has not changed his views, right? But there's a bunch of key seats where, particularly Chinese heritage Australians, in the lead up to that 2022 campaign, Dutton spoke about war with Taiwan, and that, understandably, that rattled a lot of Australians, a lot of Chinese Australians, because war involving Australia and China, that's nightmarish stuff for them, right? They've got family back in China, and they know about the might of the PLA. All of that just sounds like catastrophic stuff. Dutton doesn't talk that way at the moment. Again, he's stressing the positive.
We have focused a lot on values, so I want to finish by asking you about Cheng Lei. You actually mentioned her at the top because she's written in The Australian recently about 1 year since being released from detention in China. I want to read, for the benefit of people listening, what she wrote and just get your thoughts on it. She wrote that conflict in the Middle East has translated into violent protests in our cities with open support of terrorist organisations, targeted vandalism and misplaced hate. I shake my head at freedom abused, freedom distorted. Don't they see how this becomes fodder for authoritarian regimes' propaganda? Where would they rather be? What government would they rather have? If only they saw what I saw, felt what I felt when I came face to face with the cruelties of my birth country versus the goodness of my adopted country. Big themes there. But I'm just really interested in your thoughts on that, because at the core of this conversation and at the core of this, it's a completely different way of life that China's proposing that is for their people there. And it is what we argue against, I guess. And I'm just interested is in your role as China correspondent, North Asia correspondent. What do you think?
Well, I think, unfortunately, Cheng Lei knows better than almost anyone in the world about the differences of the Australian political system and the Chinese political system at their most extreme and what they can mean. And I think she is an absolute superstar, and it's such an honour for me that she now works at News Corp Australia. She's at Sky News now as a broadcaster. It's so great to see her back in journalism after what she went through. She, again, more than almost anyone in the world, has lived both Australian and Chinese, right, having that dual identity. And so, I listen to her on that stuff very carefully. I don't have that, right? I'm a New Zealand Australian, right? I don't come at this as someone with a sense of mixed Chinese identity. My job is to report on China so that Australians can better understand China and how China sees the world and how Australia relates to that. I think, of course, we have completely different styles or types of government. I think what Cheng Lei says in that piece, and, it's not for me to tell people what to think, but I think Cheng Lei is very persuasive. I think if you live in Australia in 2024, you're a pretty lucky person. And if you live in a liberal democracy, a functioning liberal democracy, where there's rule of law, where you have the right to vote, where the media is free to operate, you're a very, very lucky person. And if you look around the world, there's not so many countries where you could say that. And Australia's in, unfortunately, not as large a company as maybe in the best of all possible worlds. But look, China's China. China's, as Penny Wong says, China's going to keep being China. My job and the Australian government's job is not to change China. But yeah, I think what Cheng Lei said in that piece, I think really movingly, really beautifully, very intelligently, is just, Australians can't wave a wand and change the world, but be aware of where you are and the freedoms that you have in Australia and the kind of life you can live in Australia. You should, feel lucky about that.
Will, thank you so much. This has been a very, very enlightening conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. As always, if you like our interviews, please leave us a review. This is one of many interviews I've conducted with journalists this year. Some others to mention include Mia Freedman, founder of women's network Mamma Mia, business journalist John McDouling, who talks to me about the generational shift happening in Australian business. Chris Uhlmann, a political reporter cum columnist who writes a lot on the big challenges facing the West. Adam Harvey, who just returned from Israel to report on the anniversary of the October 7 attacks. And Lee Sales, on the art of journalism itself. If you're interested, all of those interviews can be found by scrolling through your News Club feed. Thanks again, and I'll be back next week.